I'll need to find a way to transfer it to YouTube, but presumably I can accomplish that.
Maybe help you on that if you need it, but there's a lot of people who can do that. Yeah.
Okay. So everybody, I have started recording. And before Steve starts, is anybody feeling, because we sort of learned that everybody basically knows each other on this call, but is anybody feeling the need for introduction? Does anybody, or should we just jump into it?
For my benefit, could you just give a snapshot of what your organization does, the Tacoma Park Mobilization? I'm somewhat familiar, but just would be good to hear what you all have been working on.
Okay, well, both Lori and I are the sort of the co-facilitators of Tacoma Park Mobilization Environment Committee. And we started this call really as part of our role as being kind of part of the MoCo CAP coalition, although we haven't been wonderful partners in that because we've been focusing on state level issues, but we've been having some involvement and want to be more involved. We're a climate organization based in Tacoma Park, and every year we set our priorities about what issues we're going to focus on, including county level issues, and a number of members of our groups were part of the advisory committees, the citizen advisory committees, in formulating the recommendations for the CAP plan, and also submitted comments to the draft CAP plan. We've also focused a lot on state level legislation, including state level legislation that can help facilitate implementation of the CAP. One of our big issues that we supported this year was community choice energy, which, if Hogan doesn't veto it, should be great in helping to facilitate the CAP.
Great, thank you.
Can I just add something?
Yeah.
This is Susan Eisendrath, and I just want to say that Diana has also been extremely involved in the composting coalition work, and I want to appreciate her work for that, and that it's also something that really has moved the ball for Montgomery County.
Thanks.
And this is Lori Montgomery. I'll just add one other thing to set it in context. Diana and I have also been involved in the Maryland Legislative Coalition Climate Justice Wing, working on state legislation, and buildings became a rather hot topic with the Climate Solutions Act this session. So we also, in our Montgomery County work, also want to understand better what the tools are and comments that have been made about those tools for the state context.
All right, take it away, Steve.
Okay, just to introduce a little bit about mandatory building performance standards. First, I work for an energy efficiency organization. This is from a study we did just over a year ago, looking at opportunities for efficiency to get greenhouse gas emissions reductions. As you can see from this slide, we can get about reduce emissions half through energy efficiency across all the sectors. The first three bars are buildings, other bars are transportation and industry, but a lot of opportunity here. I didn't put the slides in there, but in our view, it's going to be very difficult to meet goals with just renewable energy and electrification. You can do it, but it's going to be exceedingly expensive. If you want to, in the Q&A or later, we can get to that, but I just want to put that down there. As you think about buildings, and this is national data, Montgomery County is going to be a little different, and maybe Lindsay has some of the equivalent, but by 2050, still 2/3 of the energy use will be in buildings that are already in existence today. Yes, we can and should build new buildings well, but we have to get at the existing buildings. For new buildings, we made more progress. This is, again, national, but national building codes. If 1980 was an energy use of 100, you can see the national model codes have reduced it about 50%. In Montgomery County, we have a proposal to adopt the new green code. That's going to be slightly better than what you see at the endpoints here, but that just puts it in context. But for existing buildings, what has become the leading policy is mandatory building performance standards. Basically, covered buildings, and we'll get to what is covered in a minute, must meet either specific energy consumption or carbon emission targets. Again, we can get into those in a few minutes. Typically, you set the standards and provide people a number of years before they actually have to meet the standards. And then the targets are tightened periodically. And the chart at the bottom is from DC, shows how they're starting with the largest buildings generally first and moving to the medium, then moving to the small. And this doesn't show it, but then they are planning that the standards will get revised. Again, lower numbers for all three of these building classes. Now, people sometimes say, why don't people just do it on their own? And well, some people are. We estimate we are now retrofitting about 0.2% per year of our homes. So in 500 years, we will get them all. I don't think we have that long to wait. Commercial, it's a bit better. The data is not that precise, but somewhere between 1 and 2%. If you take the midpoint, that's still 67 years. We don't have that much time. So we really need to accelerate. This is a map of where things stand today. The blue is mandatory standards that have been enacted. Washington State, St. Louis, Washington, DC, New York City. I also include Boulder. Boulder is just for rental housing. So it's not a full standard. And I didn't put on here, and I should have, Reno, Nevada kind of has a commercial standard, although the alternative compliance passes is so easy that it doesn't have that much impact. Then quite a few that are considering Montgomery County, as we're about to hear, is just formally proposed things. There's also a formal proposal out in Boston, whereas the more preliminary proposals in Cambridge, Vancouver, and the other jurisdictions are still working on it, but have yet to release a formal proposal. There are other targets. Tokyo's had them for a number of years. The Netherlands has them for office buildings that are starting to take effect. The UK also has them for rental. France has standards scheduled to take effect for all homes. And of these, Tokyo, Boulder, the UK, Reno, and the Netherlands are actually being implemented. The rest are still developing the detailed proposals or detailed rules, but they have yet to actually be implemented, as in there are requirements that people need to meet. This shows the three leading enacted efforts in the US, and I put this up here. I won't go into all the details to illustrate the range of things. So in Washington State, they only cover commercial. DC and New York City, they cover, I'll say, most multifamily. I'll just simplify that. They vary in size threshold. Washington, a statewide one, is 50,000 square feet and up. DC is eventually going to get to 10,000 square feet, New York City in between. Each of these use a different metric. Washington used site energy intensity, so that's BTUs per square foot of building area. DC uses Energy Star score, which is somewhat based on site intensity. New York City is using carbon intensity, which has the advantage of getting at our ultimate goal, but it creates lots of challenges because you have to start figuring out, how do you model electricity use? Do you really want to make building owners have to do that? And do you allow RECs? And it creates a whole series of issues. DC, for example, decided to go with energy and said, we'll look at the carbon in a future iteration, but that's a key issue. Effective year, typically the middle of this decade, it does vary. For the most part, these standards are still being developed, but they require at least getting to the median level. Although in DC, if you reduce the energy use 20%, you are deemed to comply for the first period. So that's for inefficient buildings. New York City using carbon, they can go much farther than just efficiency. So they have a long-term target of 80% by 2050. And it would not surprise me if at some point 80% becomes 100%, but that's where it stands now. All of these places require revisions about every 5 years, and technical assistance is also an important component. You don't just set a standard and stand back and expect everybody to do it. A lot of people need help, particularly the smaller owners, the people who own buildings just above the threshold, multifamily, affordable housing. They're going to need lots of help, and that's going to be an important component. There are also a variety of policies. I won't go into them all. Short of full building performance standards, the stepping stones, whether it's energy audit and tune-ups, lighting upgrades, mandatory labeling, etc. And we, ACEEE, as part of a recent study, said, what if 2/3 of the communities in the US ultimately require 30% energy savings? You're going to reduce energy use and carbon emissions by 11%. So it's a pretty big contribution. Obviously, if you reach all of them, it's higher. If you start going to say 90%, it triples. So this just shows the power of these as a very important component of a carbon reduction plan. And with that, here's a link to the report. A lot of this is pulled from, or how to reach me. I'm happy to share these slides with Diana. I went through them quickly. People weren't going to have a chance to look at everything. So with that, I guess I'll take a few questions, but don't want to take too many now. We can get to discussion at the end. But any questions at this point?
One simple one. Can you drop these in the chat, the slides?
Can I drop all the slides in the chat? I'll try.
The link to it. But otherwise, just email them to me.
Okay.
Maybe the most important thing is dropping the link to the report in the chat. It was on the last slide.
Say that again.
Dropping the link to the report in the chat may be easiest, and then we can send the slides out.
Okay, sounds good. I will do that.
MoCo is doing the Energy Star means of measuring the targets. Is that right?
No, but we'll get into it. So why don't I go through our presentation? Can everyone see my screen here? I'm going to say, someone give me a thumbs up. Thank you,
Yes.
Emily. All right. So Steve, that was some great level setting and kind of intro into BEPS, and we're probably going to try to add some of your slides into our slide deck because those were great. So here's a bit about Montgomery County's Building Energy Performance Standard legislation. There is a link at the bottom here. You'll see that a couple times in this presentation. We do have a web page up that goes through some of the basics, and we'll keep updated. We have a bar at the top that updates folks on where things stand with the legislation. So that's probably the best way to get the most updated information, but we'll give folks a bit of an overview about how we got to BEPS and how you all can participate. I'm sure that folks on this call already know this slide pretty well. We have pretty aggressive climate goals in Montgomery County, and we know that with the climate action plan work that we've done, that building energy performance standard legislation and a policy in Montgomery County is one of the best way to target existing buildings. That Steven mentioned before, this concept of you have already existing emissions that are occurring in the environment, and unless they interact with permitting services, there's no way that the county can tell those buildings what to do. So this is a way for us to get them engaged in the climate conversation. Buildings make up a significant portion of emissions in Montgomery County. More than half of the emissions in the county are related to activities in the built environment, with more than a quarter coming from commercial buildings. So BEPS is a way for us to address the emissions in the existing commercial buildings by improving performance. And what that means is having buildings improve their energy efficiency over time. So a little bit of background, just adding on to Steve's presentation, which was a great way to set the scene here. But a building performance standard is a policy that jurisdictions can implement to set a minimum energy performance threshold for existing buildings. As Steve had mentioned, jurisdictions across the country are starting to adopt BEPS policies, but they're using a variety of strategies, as Steve's slide presents, and we'll have a next slide after this one that walks through some of the differences in the policies in terms of metrics that they're using, timelines, who's affected, and kind of engagement from the public sector on implementing those as well. DEP engaged a small stakeholder group in late 2019 and early 2020 to gather policy recommendations. The link here goes to that recommendations report, which you can also get to from our BEPS website. But it was presenting some information in partnership with the Institute for Market Transformation to say, here's a couple different options. Which one works best for Montgomery County? And so that's what this policy recommendations report puts out. When we were putting the legislation together, our key guiding principle for the policy was balancing flexibility for building owners and for the county from an implementation standpoint with immediate action required by our climate emergency goals here. So we think that we've struck that balance. In working with IMT, we found that the policy model that we developed together is now the policy model that IMT is recommending to other jurisdictions. So we're particularly proud that we kind of are the test bed for this new way of thinking about building performance policies. So it's really exciting. The way that we approached this was modifying the existing benchmarking law to include a performance requirement. And then we also thought, you know, we have the book open, let's fix some of the issues that we found in the benchmarking law. We'll go into what some of those are briefly, but some clarifications, kind of tightening some criteria for exemptions and waivers and ways that people can kind of tap out of benchmarking law compliance, to kind of tighten those up. But by doing this, the way that we've done it, this allows BEPS to apply in the city of Rockville and Gaithersburg without doing an additional legislative opt-in for a new policy. So the Rockville and Gaithersburg will get presentations on this policy because they do have the ability to say, nah, like we don't want that part. We'll keep the first part, but like we don't really want this performance standard thing. So we have a lot of work to do on the county side to make sure that they continue to stay opted into this. Tacoma Park is already opted in. They've taken that section of the code and it already applies in Tacoma Park. So it's just some nuance of city versus county code, but they've adopted that section of the code, it applies, and then they've added on to it because it's Tacoma Park. They're not just going to take what the county does, they're going to go a step further, which is great. What this does, as Steve had on that map slide, how we've gone about introducing this policy is this creates the framework and it establishes BEPS in the county. It gives us some basic definitions. It tells people who's going to have to comply, by what time frame, how the county is going to move forward with this. But then we have basically making sure that council wants to do this, getting them to pass BEPS first. And then we're going to come back with regulations by June 1st of 2022 to come back with some of the more technical details, which we've seen other jurisdictions do, is they pass the law and then they come back with some of the details on how it's actually going to be implemented. Similar to Steve's slide here, an overview of Washington, D.C., New York City, and Washington State. St. Louis, Missouri also has a very active building performance policy. So we've included that here. And we've actually had a lot of conversations with St. Louis and of course, Washington, D.C., because they're right across the border, about implementation of our policy. So we've done some good partnership work to make sure that we're taking the best elements of those policies and making sure that they're incorporated in Montgomery counties, and maybe taking some lessons learned from those other jurisdictions and not do what they did where they found some trouble. We'll send out these slides after the presentation as well, so you can take a closer look at this. I did want to start off, as I mentioned earlier, our building performance policy is based off of our benchmarking law. That was passed in May of 2014. We've been working on this for a while. The key takeaway here is that the foundational component for BEPS policies is a benchmarking law. We've had that in place for a number of years. The majority of our built environment in Montgomery County, 50,000 square feet and greater, needs to comply with this law. For commercial buildings, residential was initially not included. With these amendments, we are going to include them. I'll get into that in a minute. Building owners are using Portfolio Manager to collect data and report it to the county. Data verification, which is not in every benchmarking law, is in Montgomery counties. We took that best practice from Chicago. So Chicago, Evanston, Illinois, and recently Washington, D.C. They are now requiring data verification. So we were one of the leading edge jurisdictions doing that work to ensure that the data coming across the wires is actually good quality. We found another number of jurisdictions didn't have data verification. They were getting real wonky data, and it really wasn't helpful to anybody. Buildings that are covered under the county's benchmarking law need to report to the county by June 1st every year. That deadline is coming up. So if the more that you can help us spread the word, Emily has done an incredible job improving our compliance over the last year and a half. So we're up at a 93. Emily's gonna shake her head, or 92. Shoot. All right. Well, you should have been quiet and I would have given you an extra percent. So we're at a 92% compliance rate, which is incredible. And we've also gotten to learn the citation and court system in Montgomery County, because that's how you can get folks to comply. So the results of the benchmarking law are that building owners have a better understanding of their energy bills. We have a better understanding of the good performers and the poor performers in the county, and where our energy trends are going. Some of the analysis work that Emily has done for buildings that have consistently benchmarked in Montgomery County is that they're seeing approximately a 2% reduction in their utility bills over the 3 years or so that we have consistent data from buildings that have consistently benchmarked. On our benchmarking website, and maybe Emily can throw it in the chat, is the most recent benchmarking report. If folks haven't taken a look at that, you should. It's incredible. For a county report, county government report, it's got to be the best looking report out there. So definitely take a look. But again, that benchmarking law is a foundational policy for BEPS in Montgomery County. Excuse me. So I talked about how we're going to expand the benchmarking law. But unfortunately, I'm having a bit of a coughing attack, allergies. I'm just gonna pop off for a second, come right back.
I think I can jump in here. Yeah, so like Lindsay mentioned, our current benchmarking law covers non-residential commercial buildings that are 50,000 square feet greater. So those were phased in over time, starting with the largest buildings, 250,000 square feet and greater as group 1. And then group 2, 50,000 square feet and greater. So amendments to the benchmarking law, and then also that include BEPS, cover additional county-owned buildings, so 25,000 to 50,000 square feet, additional non-residential properties. So we fold in some of the smaller commercial buildings, and also bring in some of the property types that were previously exempted, like warehousing, self-storage, and there's a couple other nuances in there. And then I think most importantly is that we start to cover multifamily buildings. So kind of like with commercial properties, we're going to focus on covering the largest multifamily properties first, and then bring in the smaller properties. We have a ton of multifamily building stock in the county, so it'll be great that we're finally folding those into the program. That's really where we're getting most of our additional building coverage.
Thank you for covering for me, Emily. Sorry, I'm having a bit of a coughing fit. So with the changes that Emily described, this is how we plan on seeing that impact the building stock in Montgomery County, countywide. So currently we cover about 40% of the commercial floor area, but with these changes, that'll ramp up to approximately 85% of the commercial and multifamily floor area in Montgomery County. So these amendments would be big. There are a lot of buildings right now that are not engaging in the benchmarking program. They're not necessarily, Montgomery County takes that opportunity to engage with those building owners about the Empower Maryland incentives that are available to them. So there are multifamily building owners that they might be aware of these incentives, but having this requirement helps with outreach and engagement, because they have to talk to us. So that also helps. Specifically in Tacoma Park, y'all don't have a lot of commercial space necessarily that is subject to comply with the benchmarking law, just because they're smaller strip malls, some retail strip malls out in like Ward 5, Ward 6. So not a ton of large buildings that need to comply with the benchmarking law. However, when we add in multifamily, that's when we see a number of buildings that will need to start reporting in Tacoma Park specifically. And we've already engaged with city staff on starting to outreach to these groups that will have to start complying with the benchmarking law. And eventually, once they've benchmarked for 3 years, that gives them enough data to develop a baseline, and then they'll phase into the building performance standard requirements. So let's get into our BEPS. This is the exciting part. So we have our foundation, we're good to go with benchmarking, we're moving forward, but we need that benchmarking law, which we've had in place for a long time, to move forward on BEPS. So this is the BEPS trajectory model. These are sample buildings that show how the policy tools of how we're moving forward. So Montgomery County has selected the site energy use intensity, or site EUI, which is a measure of how efficiently a building is using energy per square foot of space. So you're able to compare a very large, office building with a smaller strip mall, and just to see how they're using energy per square foot. It's a way to normalize that data so you can compare buildings that are very different from one another. But County Executive Elrich is very interested in using this policy to incentivize on-site solar. So right now, there's not necessarily a pot of money available to incentivize, but if we can incentivize building owners to look at on-site solar as a way of compliance, then that will hopefully expand the amount of solar that is on our rooftops in Montgomery County. So when you take into account the on-site generation of solar, we're looking at a net normalized site EUI number. So we're normalizing for weather, and we're adding in this concept of net, which means that buildings will be judged against the amount of energy they're consuming minus their solar generation. I had mentioned the building baseline. We're looking at average historical energy use. So each building gets their own custom baseline, but they are judged against these interim and final standards, which apply to each property type. So office buildings, multifamily buildings, houses of worship, storage facilities, they're all going to get different types of end targets. They're all going to be the same, but buildings are starting out at their own custom baseline. So it's more adjusted to how they have been performing in the past and what we're asking them to do in the future. So similar to the benchmarking law, buildings are going to report their data using Energy Star Portfolio Manager. They already have to do that under the benchmarking law. But every 4 years, we're going to check in with them to make sure that they're on track to meet that final target. So again, we're not doing what other jurisdictions are doing, where it's a 5-year dash. The jurisdiction evaluates how they're doing, and then they set another 5-year goal, and then there's another run. Buildings are able to take this target into consideration when they're doing their capital upgrades, when they're looking at their planning cycles or their refinancing cycles, to say, I have this long-term target. I know what I need to meet. It's out in the future. It's not going to change on me in 15 years. I know what the target is, and I can plan for that. So there's a real benefit to having this long-term target, because not every building is going to be in a state to upgrade their building when the county says they have to. That there is a natural cycle that building owners will upgrade their buildings anyway, as Steve had mentioned before. This just helps them make the more efficient choice, or think about how their building's operating in the future with a lens of energy efficiency on top of it. If they have a big tenant move out happening, if they have an opportunity to take advantage of lower interest financing to do upgrades, this is saying bring energy efficiency to the table when we have that conversation. I just want to mention that the targets that we're setting are going to be defined in regulation. So we're doing analysis right now to determine what those targets are going to be for each property type. And so moving forward, we'll have that established in regulation later on. We're doing that analysis right now. We do have this, we talked about the concept of flexibility. So if a property cannot reasonably meet these standards, the county can accept what's called a building performance improvement plan. And other jurisdictions have a concept of this in their legislation in some way. we were advised against very strongly doing a prescriptive compliance pathway. This is our way of addressing that, to say, we don't have a menu of options for you to pick and choose from. We're not going to make you do anything necessarily. You need to find what's best for your building type, because the county is not an expert in every type of building type that's out there. We're saying, you bring the expertise to us and we'll sign off on it. If you're not able to meet your standard, tell us why. If you're at this first interim point, you have an 83 on the books, but you need to make a 90, or you're at a 90 and you need to make an 83, you're not going to make it. So tell us what you're going to do to make this final target of 50 and what that looks like for you. It'll include documentation of what can be achieved, potential improvements, and the costs associated with each of those, a timeline, and having that building owner commit to doing the things that are in that plan. And once they have one of those plans on file, they'll be considered in compliance. Because again, we don't want to just come out with a stick. We want to make sure that building owners are achieving the energy savings they can achieve over time. So if they meet what's in their BEPS, they'll be considered in compliance. Another key element that is in a number of building performance policies across the country is a building advisory board. They will be making recommendations on BEPS implementation, like approving those BPIPs, but the county is the ultimate decision-making authority, which is something that other jurisdictions have. It's kind of a gradient scale of how much the private sector and outside parties have in implementing the law. The county still remains the decider, but we'll have 15 voting members with 2 3-year terms, very similar to the boards, committees, and commission structure that's in the county, of staggered terms and being appointed by the county council after being recommended by the county executive. So there's different buckets of backgrounds that need to be met in terms of the representation on the board. And this board would be advised on unique building situations, the building performance improvement plans, changes in building ownership or changes in property use type, and how to deal with that to set realistic timeframes for, say, a building was an office but now has become a warehouse. What does their new performance plan look like? So this group would be involved in making that, on making recommendations on what the county should do for that building type. But again, once the legislation's passed, then we'll work on putting that board together. So here's a snapshot of what BEPS looks like long term. So there's a lot of work to be done in 2021 and 2022. As Emily mentioned, we have a number of buildings that need to benchmark first before they can have a performance standard. So those are the blue and the green bubbles here. So they need to benchmark for a number of years, they get a baseline, and then they're entered into the BEPS compliance cycle. But the buildings that are already benchmarking have enough data to begin developing a baseline and moving forward. So they're the orange bubbles down here. So these are our 4-year time horizons, and then a checkpoint, 4-year time horizon, then a checkpoint, and then the evaluation of a final standard starting in 2035 and going out to 2037 and 2038 after that. So take another look at that when we send out these slides later. Same with this slide. This is just a quick summary of the things that we've talked about here, of who's covered, the compliance cycle, who's going to be on the advisory board. It's just a bit of discussion about the technical assistance. We are working on what that's going to look like in the county. We've talked to the DC Building Innovation Hub about expanding regionally and covering Montgomery County. So that's an area that we're really excited by, but we want to make sure that the legislation passes first before we move forward on offering something like that to building owners, where this outside group would help building owners with the compliance elements, understanding the law in their terms, understanding the kind of legislative speak, but translating it, which is a big element of what the DC Innovation Hub is doing. But then also helping them, connecting them to the resources that they will need to comply. So they're kind of like an additional help both to the county in terms of outreach and education, and building owners to just say, I don't know where to start, what do I do? So this helps them get on that next path. So what's next for the BEPS legislation in Montgomery County? The BEPS legislation was introduced to council last week. So it now has its very own bill number. So we're pretty excited by that. So it's Bill 1621, rolls off the tongue. So that was transmitted to council on April 1st, but they were in the middle of budget season. So they formally introduced it on May 14th. Mark your calendar. The public hearing is scheduled for June 15th at 1:30 p.m. They are accepting letters of support, and you can sign up to give testimony, all that good stuff. Thanks, Steve. ACEEE is already working on a letter of support. Appreciate that. So I would say that if this group wants to submit any type of letter of support or comments to your council members, I would do that by June 9th or June 10th to make sure it gets in the staff packet in time. But I had mentioned before, we're still working on the data analysis. We need to learn more about our buildings, and if we're going to set appropriate standards and how much greenhouse gas emissions that this policy can save in Montgomery County, we need to know what that's going to look like. So we're doing that data analysis now to figure out what targets we're going to set, what that's going to require of building owners. We understand that council members are going to want to know, how much is this going to cost? And we want to make sure that we can answer that question when they ask us that. So in that time, we're working on what the regulations are going to look like, what the standards are going to look like. But we also are talking to various stakeholders, you all included. You all are stakeholders because you're key climate advocates in Montgomery County. So we want to make sure that you all know about this policy, the impact that it can have, and to make sure that if you have questions about it, that we can answer it. So we're doing this presentation to a number of different groups, including those in the built environment, so they are aware of what these standards are and that they know what is coming down the pike. So if they are in the process of doing an upgrade right now, that they can start planning for it. So we're doing that outreach. We're working on training materials. Emily put together a really nice one-pager about what BEPS is and what it means for building owners in Montgomery County. That's on that BEPS website I mentioned before, and it's also on the last slide, so don't worry. Once that legislation is passed, we're going to work on putting the advisory board together and establishing that technical assistance hub, both bringing that building innovation hub up to Montgomery County. And then we're also looking at something a little bit more direct hand-holding for building owners that really are not plugged into this stuff at all and really need to get educated. So we want to try to develop something that's a little bit more direct for those building owners. And in that time, while we're doing all this other stuff, DEP's got regulations to draft and send that over by June 1st, 2022. So the number one question we get asked is, okay, now what can I do? Now what do I do? So the first thing is, let's get this passed. Building owners, I think some of them don't like change or being told what to do in their buildings. So I anticipate that we are going to get some letters of not support. So we're hoping to get letters of support to county council so they know that people want this in Montgomery County. Keep talking about BEPS with other organizations. Talk about it at the state level. It sounds like this group does a lot of work at the state. Keep talking about building performance standards and what that means for building owners in the county. Keep staying engaged with DEP as we're drafting regulations. We still want to hear from stakeholders in the community. And if anyone in this group is interested in serving on the advisory board, we're kind of keeping an interest list. So if folks are interested in serving on that board, raise your hand, let us know, send us an email, and we can add you to that list so that when that is open for application, we can send that to you to let you know. And if folks on this phone have a building to manage, like a certain congregation on this phone, Walter. Walter's already doing all this great work, which is awesome. Start exploring the energy efficiency opportunities that are offered through your utility on the Empower Maryland surcharge on your bill. Everyone pays into it, even residents. So make sure that you know about this program to get money back out of it. If you have facility managers in your buildings, there is a severely discounted O&M training. There's training classes that you can take, and I believe that they're discounted up to 90% through the utility. So you only have to pay a little bit to learn how to better run your building. The building tune-up program and the monitoring-based commissioning programs are a lighter touch and have some pretty significant savings if they reach a certain Energy Star score with the retro commissioning. And then if you're doing actual upgrades in the building, there are prescriptive and custom rebates that are available through your utility company. And people think that Empower is an organization. It's not. It's just a program run through your utility company. So definitely call them up. Washington Gas and the electricity companies all offer some sort of Empower Maryland incentives. So now we'll take questions, but here's this BEPS website that we have information up on there, and some more information like this presentation in a written form essentially, but you can reach out to myself, Stan Edwards, or Emily Curley with questions that you have. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so I could see all of your faces again. Hello, and take questions. And Stan and Emily can jump in if I missed anything.
And why don't I call on folks? Walter.
Yeah, so in a big building, you may have multiple tenants, each of them controlling their own energy usage by setting their thermostats, by buying their appliances. So how does the building owner have any control over that?
That's a really good question, and one that is going to be hard to overcome. That's called split incentive, where the building owner owns and runs the building, but the tenants pay and control their own bills and control their own energy use inside their units. It's definitely an issue, but one that there are some higher level things that building owners control that the tenants don't control, like insulation and windows, sometimes larger energy systems that serve the whole building. So you may have tenants in a building that are running their heat and keeping their window open. I used to live in a multifamily building. People do that all the time. You can't necessarily control that. You can't lock the windows and you can't go in and turn people's thermostats, but there's an education component to this too, where the tenants need to be invested as much in BEPS as the owners. So the owners are the ones on the hook, but there's an education component as well to this. So sounds like Stan and Emily also want to chime in on that one.
Yeah, I would say more practically speaking, as far as the payments for non-compliance, part of the reason we're calling them payments is so that owners can more easily pass those through to tenants. Penalties, fines, words like that apparently are precluded from being passed through to tenants, but with hopefully how we're setting that up, that would be another compelling reason for tenants to also come along. So that's another item, which hopefully it doesn't get to that, but at the end of the day, that would be a possibility.
Also have their lease arrangements that you can make with tenants in your building to address this as well.
Lori?
So I want to follow up, Stan, thanks for replying about the Montgomery County Housing Authority. Just wanted to follow up a little bit. I'm just beginning to learn about HUD programs and how public housing, because we as part of our work statewide are interested certainly in affordable housing and low income housing and how they not be at the end of the list for energy efficiency since they pay a disproportionate percentage of their income for utilities. Though in housing authorities, that's covered centrally. So I'm just curious, to what degree, and maybe you don't know this, and this is part of your exploration with them, but HUD does require energy performance audits every 5 years, and they do have a system where they can do energy performance contracting. I don't know if that's exclusively county-owned public housing or whether it's where there's nonprofits or Section 8 or other programs, but I would encourage you, because at the federal level, as part of additional investments, there may be more funds available. This may be part of the Biden administration's climate energy efficiency push. So there may be some real opportunities. And I would just say, again, philosophically, if Montgomery County Housing could lead the way on affordable housing to show other low income multifamily units how it can be done, how it can be financed, what are innovative techniques, that may be a great way to model it or demonstrate it for other building owners across the county. And the more we save in terms of the cost of O&M of running buildings and paying for utilities, the more we can help keep rents more affordable. So just a suggestion.
Yeah, we have lots of research and conversations to have on affordable housing, because that's I think one of our primary concerns is we definitely don't want to. There is an intersection between energy climate policy and housing policy, right? And we don't want energy climate policy to be the reason that there's not that there's less affordable housing. We have a problem already with enough affordable housing. And affordable housing, I'm not an expert in it, but I'm learning there's many types of affordable housing, right? From naturally occurring affordable housing to very regulated affordable housing. And all those are important. And we need to figure out how to address all those within BEPS. And so one of the things, we're looking at a lot of different things. Someone in the chat mentioned the Green Bank and what they might be able to do. And so maybe there's programs the Green Bank can offer specifically for affordable housing. Again, whatever that means, affordable housing, because there are lots of different types. So, and they have a mandate in their bylaws to work on affordable housing issues. So they've done a lot of work in that area. You know, we'll utilize them, but also HOC, MHT, you know, there's lots of organizations involved in affordable housing. So that'll be something we'll be looking at a lot in the future here.
And the other note that I put in the chat, you know, that maybe just a piece of this puzzle is, you know, Empower and Empower payments. And I gather that Empower is up for reauthorization next year. So it's an opportunity to fix some of the things like fuel switching and, you know, other things that are flawed within Empower. So, you know, if you all have ideas, I think there's the PSC may have, or somebody we just learned has a committee working on Empower reauthorization. So it may be an opportunity to just make it better.
Yep, we're on it. It's a lot of meetings, but I will say, and to Steve's credit, that ACEEE has, I don't want to say taken over that group, but has a very strong voice in that group. So I'm thrilled that is happening. Brian Howard's an awesome legislative person, so I'm pleased to see that he went from USGBC over to ACEEE.
One of the things that, with respect to Empower, that we're going to talk to our Office of Intergovernmental Relations about, but Empower, as you know, is focused on electricity and now gas reduction, those utilities, and all the funding from Power, which we all pay on our energy bills, goes to the utilities to do programs, and those are good programs. I don't quibble with the programs they offer, but we believe that some of that funding might be utilized by jurisdictions to do various things. In some places, you're very focused on climate mitigation. Some places are very focused on climate adaptation, and localities might be able to use some of that funding. So that's definitely a conversation we want to have, and that would require changes at the state level in the Maryland Empower law. So it's not something that's going to happen overnight.
And that's been in discussion in that future programming work group is, are the recommendations that we're talking about here and the new goals that we're setting, will they require legislative changes to Empower? And I think that is on the table for this group, which I'm excited to hear.
Walter?
So with the CCE and with the move to make Maryland, you know, power in general much cleaner, how is that going to affect the BEPS plan in Montgomery County? I understand, I mean, on the face of it, if we're only talking about energy efficiency, then it doesn't matter whether you're getting clean energy or dirty energy, you still have to become more efficient. But so it sounds like to me there shouldn't be much change in the BEPS, but am I right in thinking that?
Stan remuted himself, which
I just had some noise in the background. So these things go hand in hand, right? Efficiency and cleaning up the remaining fuels that you're using. So the research we're doing right now that Lindsay referred to is about reducing the amount of on-site fossil fuel you use, namely natural gas, although oil is used in some cases, but mostly natural gas. And then making sure the electricity that you use, because it doesn't do any good to, or it does less good to electrify things if you're still not using clean power. So we have to both clean the grid and use less energy to begin with.
And I will say that the metric that we chose, site EUI, when we're looking at electrification and cleaning the grid, that metric that we've selected does encourage electrification in buildings. So if, as you're moving forward and looking to improve your performance in your building, that the metric that we've chosen here does also incentivize electrification.
I just have a warning about that, because when I talk to my architect friends, they, say, well, if you burn natural gas in a power plant and then put it on the grid and take it to your building and bring energy in that way, you lose 2/3 of it. Whereas if you burn it on site, you get 90% of it or whatever. And so they caution about how cutting down natural gas on site may in fact, not be as good as we would like it to be for the overall environment. So I don't have an answer to that, but
Steve does.
Right. Yes, if you're talking today, but the grid is getting progressively cleaner, and by the call it 2040, these buildings will all exist well after that. We're going to have a close to 100% clean grid, and it won't apply. And again, as Lindsay pointed out, you need to be planning these things. I would say people need to be planning for electrification, as I already hear is starting to happen in New York City, knowing that there are 2035, 2050 targets. When you have a major system replacement, start thinking about it then. It's not immediate. A couple of other things I wanted to add. People were talking about affordable housing. Yes, there's a good chance there'll be some money for public housing. There's also a number of federal proposals for broader multifamily and federal affordable housing. Probably the leading one would give incentives of $2,000, $8,000 per unit for energy efficiency upgrades. It's $2,000 to $4,000 for middle income, but when you get to be affordable, it doubles. Senator Chris Van Hollen is the Senate sponsor of that one. There are other ones, but that one's already passed the House last year, so it's considered to be a leading one. Also, a decent chance the federal 170/90 tax deduction will be expanded to include retrofits. We'll know more in the next few weeks. House Ways and Means is working on that. But building owners are going to need some help, and hopefully the federal government will be there for some of that. I'd also point out, Lori, picking up on your comment that the Climate Solutions Now bill ran into problems over building, including building retrofits, and it had a provision to eventually reduce energy use in large buildings by 40%. Lindsay, if I understand correctly, and I wasn't sure if this is illustrative or in the legislation, of getting 50% reductions by, call it the late 2030s. No, it is an illustration.
Yes, that is
Thank
only
you.
there to show how BEPS would work, but is no numbers are
Yeah.
in that slide.
Anyway, the important point is hopefully before we get to next year's legislative session, this will be finalized, and maybe that will be useful. What Montgomery County decided to help convince legislators, including a committee chairman who is a Montgomery County legislator.
Yeah, we need to get them to understand this process.
One thing I just wanted to follow up on Steve's point there about a clean grid. I agree with him that that's what we're targeting as a clean grid, but I just want to emphasize that doesn't come without its own challenges. I mean, there's significant issues that need to be addressed in that, and that's going to take a pretty Herculean effort to get there. I'm hopeful that we will, but it's not going to happen easily.
I have a couple questions about funding in the budget, whether it's already there or it's something we need to be advocating for, but particularly funding for the technical support piece of it, like what DC has. I saw a reference in, I think, Elrich's cover letter that he's hoping by getting enabling legislation to increase penalties for non-compliance, that that's how that would be funded. But I'm wondering if it could be otherwise funded, because it's actually a pretty important piece of this. And the other thing I'm wondering about is whether there are currently plans to allocate money, additional monies to the Green Bank for funding some of this.
So the state enabling legislation to have higher compliance incentives instead of, we don't want to call them penalties or violations, or assessment fees is also okay, to have that done at the state level. Right now, the county is capped at a local enabling level of about $1,000 for a fine. And right now, a Class A violation is $500 for the first offense and $750 for repeat offenses. So that is even to get that amount of money is a very high administrative burden on staff to do the court process to get those funds. So we are looking for a higher level enabling legislation at the state to allow jurisdictions that enact building performance standard policies to levy higher fines. We're trying to figure out what the structure of that's going to look like. We were initially looking at a per square foot dollar value, similar to what DC has done. But we heard from some affordable housing advocates that they have high square footage, low valuation, and therefore a high, just doing a per square foot compliance incentive would be setting the affordable housing groups back a little bit. So we're looking at a different, trying to think of a different way around that, which takes building valuation into consideration, but we haven't quite cracked the code on that. And we also need to find a state level sponsor to introduce that. So that's going to be a longer range plan. So as Carl had pointed out in the chat, our fiscal impact statement for the bill does carve out some additional funds, hopefully out of the budget to start seeding this concept of a technical assistance hub and what that might look like. And we do have right now in the FY22 budget, DEP has the ability to hire one staff person. That position's been allocated for quite some time. So we're hoping to recast that as a building performance program manager. So we have one staff person that we can bring on to help us out with this. And then starting in FY23, hopefully we'll have some additional funds to come in for that technical assistance piece. So it wouldn't necessarily be coming from that, from the penalties, just because we're not going to start seeing the first time that those penalties might come into play is 2026. So we wouldn't see any funding from that for quite some time. So I don't want to, while that's a strategy, that's not our only strategy. In terms of getting funds to the Green Bank, I think that's a good idea. We are working with the Green Bank about what financing would be available and different tools that building owners can use to make sure that they are providing a suite of options for building owners. So that's something that we've been talking to them about quite a bit, and they already have tools in place and active now on the street that people can start upgrading their buildings with. So the Clear product, they've been talking about this commercial PPA product, all these things they're saying these are strategies to meet BEPS.
Okay, great. And we really appreciate this. Has been incredibly informative, and I'd actually really love it if we could keep talking. But we're going to talk to Brian Bomer about IECC, and we're all just slightly late for that call. So we've got to run. If anybody doesn't have the link for the Brian Bomer call, let me know, and I'll share it again.
I just want to say thank you. This has been hugely helpful.
Yeah, it's been great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, we're happy to brief you all, and if there are other questions that come up, just let us know. We're here.
All right. Thank you so much.